And now on Esoteric Cliffnotes, we have The Immortal Mind, Science and the Continuity of Consciousness Beyond the Brain by Ervin, Laszlo, with Anthony Peake. I'm going to skip the prologue and just go to part 1. The evidence, consciousness beyond the brain. Chapter 1, Near-Death Experiences. Near-death experiences do arise during unconsciousness. So that's kind of all forms, either sleep or knocked out unconscious. As she heard the bone saw activate, about 90 minutes into the process, Pam saw her body from the outside and felt herself being pulled into a tunnel of light. At the end of the tunnel, she saw her deceased grandmother and other deceased relatives. Then she was told by an uncle that she had to return. She felt him push her back into her body, and on entering it, she described her experience as like diving into a pool of ice-cold water. It hurt. And this is a woman that had that accident and was obviously going under surgery. All right. The significant fact about the NDE, or near-death experience, is that conscious experience takes place during the time when the brain is clinically dead. Chapter 2, Apparitions and After-Death Communication. The Peake and the Julia X cases present evidence that the living person can, under certain circumstances, perceive information regarding the death of another. There was, however, a case in which information presented by the departed was so strong that it stood up in a court of law. And with that example, it was somebody who had dreamt that their father had hidden something somewhere, and they found it hidden, and it went into court of law because they had to contest the will with a new will. A young woman called Doris, who was dying of a hemorrhage after the birth of a child. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she had a vision of her father approaching her. He had been dead a few years, and clearly she perceived this as a message from beyond, that it was her time to die. The concerned medical staff decided that drastic action was needed to bring her out of this morbidity. Her baby was brought to her in an attempt to make her wish to live. This had the desired effect in that it brought about a crisis. Doris felt obliged to stay for the sake of her newborn baby, but was also aware that a wonderful new world was available to her. It appears that phenomena, visions, and apparitions are not exceptional. Recently deceased persons seem to appear on occasion to the living, and even to communicate with the living. Chapter 3, Medium-Transmitted Communication. It was quickly discovered that Indridson had powerful mediumistic skills. There were reports of him levitating into the air while in communication with his controls. Indridson's primary control was his deceased great-uncle, Conrad Gillisson, a professor of Nordic literature at Copenhagen University, who had died in 1891. However, it was later recorded that 26 other spirits had spoken through him. It was thus under fairly controlled conditions that the seance of November 24, 1905 took place. Jensen Indridson case not only offers a strikingly convincing evidence for remote extrasensory perception, to use Ryan's terminology, but the motivational factor offers an intriguing argument for Emil Jensen being an independent entity, distinct from the person of Indridson. Wolfgang Eisenbeis, an amateur chess player, engaged the medium Robert Rowlands to transmit the moves of a game played by the living Victor Korchnoi, when the world's third-ranked grandmaster, with a player whom Rowlands was to find in a state of trance. Eisenbeis gave Rowlands a list of deceased grandmasters and requested Rowlands to enter the state of trance and ask who among the deceased grandmasters would be willing to play. Markovsky was the third-ranking grandmaster in the year 1900. Rowlands transmitted the reason given by Markovsky. I will be at your disposal in this peculiar game of chess for 2 reasons. First, because I also want to do something to aid mankind living on Earth to become convinced that death does not end everything, but instead the mind is separated from the physical body and comes up to us in a new world, where individual life continues to manifest itself in a new, unknown dimension. Second, being a Hungarian patriot, I want to guide the eyes of the world into the direction of my beloved Hungary. It's quite nice. In the above cases, the messages conveyed by the mediums seem to have originated with an entity that had information that neither the mediums themselves nor anyone they could access is likely to have possessed. It appears that the contacted entity is a quasi-living consciousness that is not the consciousness of a presently living person. Chapter 4. Instrumental Transcommunication. In 1845, Michael Faraday noted that when light traveled through transparent material, it was affected by a magnet. This became known as the Faraday effect. In 1901, in Siberia, the American ethnographer Waldemar Borgas was researching the customs of the Chukchi shamans. Much to his surprise, as he was witnessing these ceremonies, he has heard disembodied voices, which were also recorded by the phonograph. In his book, Talking to the Dead, George Norway wrote that at a later session, the shamans communicated directly with the source of the voices, and they obliged by again manifesting the voices and letting them be recorded. The Portuguese-Brazilian Oscar Darganel seems to have been the first to receive real telephone conversations from the deceased. In the little book in Portuguese called Voices of the Beyond by the Telephone, he described in detail how he had hundreds of clear conversations through the telephone with deceased friends and family members, as well as with previously unknown personalities. He obtained information from them that was unknown to everybody involved and was able to later confirm and verify the authenticity of the information. Through O'Neill, the deceased Muller also gave his social security number, but of even more significance, he described in detail the machine he had invented for the treatment of arthritis. This information was not in the public domain. Indeed, it was only known to Mueller himself. Meek's team subsequently built a prototype following the instructions of the deceased scientist, and it worked effectively. Over time, he became convinced that the way to make the communication more effective was to use white noise in the frequency domain of ultrasound, above the audible range of 20 to 20,000 hertz, that magnetic tape recorders can capture. More recently, Dr. Anabela Cardoso, a Portuguese senior career diplomat, carried out a series of remarkable experiments. She used white noise from shortwave radios and an AM radio tuned to around 1500 kilohertz as an acoustic background. This frequency is known as the wave by EVP experimenters, as this is the frequency which with Jurgensen had the most success. Cases of video transcommunication. In November 1982, a group of friends in Germany met with Klaus Schreiber, who suggested that they should try EVP themselves. He turned on a tape recorder and invited a dead friend to join them. They all sat in silence as the tape recorded the ambient sounds in the room. After 10 minutes or so, they switched the machine off and played back what had been recorded. Initially, nothing was heard. Then, as the tape came to an end, they all clearly heard the words, "Hello, friends." I do not think I should ask whether they are dead. How do you say to someone you talk to, "Are you dead?" But ask instead, "Who are you and how many are you?" The answer that comes in Hungarian is indistinct, but I can make it out. "We are all here," a voice adds. "The Holy Spirit knows all languages." Then I ask, "Is it difficult for you to talk to me like this?" thinking of the seemingly strenuous breathing that preceded the conversation. A woman answers quite clearly and in Hungarian, "We have some difficulties or obstacles." Chapter 5. Past Life Recollection. Regression in altered states of consciousness is often taken as evidence that we had previous lives. Having lived before present life and living again beyond it is an age-old belief. Evidence from the earliest burials show that our ancestors interred their dead with great care and supplied them with tools and other utilities essential for their next life. Through hypnosis, Freud was able to take his patients back to the source of these fears and phobias, enabling him to help his patients get rid of them. For Freud's student Carl Jung, this was evidence of the existence of a collective unconscious in which each individual can access the memories of the broader consciousness that contains all human experiences. Over a long career, Bjorkhem conducted over 600 regressions, many of which involved subjects speaking in languages that were ordinarily unknown to them. A woman named Mirabella was able to write in 28 different languages and dialects in her hypnotic trance state. Following his standard procedure, he hypnotically regressed the woman back to the car crash. She then relived in detail the events that had led up to the accident. Not only did she relive the accident and release much buried trauma held in her body, but she also proceeded to replay the experience of watching herself from above as ambulance men pulled her body from the wreckage. She then saw her body taken to the hospital and undergoing surgery. Next, she felt herself drifting up to a higher realm and meeting with beings of light she recognized as deceased members of her family, who told her that her work on earth was not finished and that she must return. She remembered the pain of coming back into her body. Prior to the regression, she had not remembered any of this. Chapter 6. Reincarnation. In esoteric literature, this is known as the transmigration of the spirit or soul. It is said to occur in the womb, perhaps already at conception or shortly afterward, when the rhythmic pulses begin that develop into the heart of the embryo. The spirit or soul of an individual does not necessarily migrate to another individual. Buddhist teachings, for example, tell us that the soul or spirit does not always reincarnate on the earthly plane and in human form. It may not reincarnate at all, evolving to a spiritual domain to where it either does not return or returns only to fulfill a task it was to accomplish in its preceding incarnation. After the age of 8, the experiences tend to fade, and with few exceptions, vanish entirely in adolescence. And these are reincarnation-type experiences or memories that children have. Those who suffer a violent death seem to be more frequently reincarnated than those who died in a natural way. Some of the experiences recounted by the children have been verified as the experience of a person who had lived previously and whose death matched the impressions reported by the child. Sometimes the child carried a birthmark associated with the death of the person with whom he or she identified, such as an indentation or discoloration on the part of the body where a fatal bullet entered, or a malformation on a hand or the foot the deceased had lost. In all, Ian Stevenson recorded 49 separate points regarding the life of Bia, as described by Swarnlata, that were subsequently confirmed by one or more independent witnesses. He considered this as one of his strongest cases, related in 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. Whether the person who is re-experienced has been reincarnated in the individual, or if the deceased consciousness is just called up, assumingly from a deeper level of reality, it is beyond all reasonable doubt that a deceased person can be re-experienced and seemingly relived by a living person. Part 2. The Science. Cosmos and Consciousness. Chapter 7. The Rediscovery of the Deep Dimension. A new paradigm is emerging at the leading edge of science, a paradigm where information rather than matter is the basic reality, and where space and time and the entities that emerge and evolve in space and time are manifestations of a deeper reality beyond space and time. The discovery of the amplituhedron suggests that space-time, if not entirely illusionary, is not fundamental. It is the result of geometrical relationships at a deeper level. It appears that particles that had never existed in the same quantum state at the same time can still be entangled. The experimenters realized that this could only be if the state of the first photon is conserved in space-time. Repeated experiments on entanglement show that not just some quanta are entangled beyond the classical confines of space and time, but all quanta are. The holographic hypothesis claims that the entangled three-dimensional events that emerge in space-time are not ultimate realities, but projections of holographic codes at a deeper level of reality. The codes are not necessarily at the periphery of space-time, as suggested by Hogan among others, nor are they likely to be in another universe, which are proposed by Brian Greene. The Akasha paradigm views events in space-time as manifestations of fundamental relations in the Akashic deep dimension. That dimension is an integral whole, a holographic totality without space and time. Chapter 8. Consciousness and the Cosmos. Your consciousness is not your consciousness. It is the manifestation of the longing of the cosmos for itself. It comes to you through you, but not from you. Consciousness exists in the cosmos whether or not it is transmitted by a living brain. Consciousness is a cosmic dimension, and the brain is a local entity. The consciousness associated with the brain is a localized manifestation of the Akasha, the deep dimension of the cosmos. Part 3. The Explanation. Chapter 9. Re-experiencing consciousness. The recall from the Akasha. And there was nothing in there. Chapter 10. Death and Beyond. The return to the Akasha. Tibetan Buddhism describes the transition beyond earthly life as passage through the bardo. Bardo means intermediate or transitional, or in-between states. The classical account comes from Hellenic mythology. It speaks of Hades, the domain of the dead, traversed by 5 great rivers, the Styx, the Archeon, the Cocytus, the Phlegethon, and the Lethe. Sojourn in Hades was not for eternity. Within its vast timelessness, there was a period when, once completed, the deceased, whom the Greeks called the shade, would be expected to go back and relive its life. However, before returning, the shade had to drink from the waters of one of the 5 rivers, the Lethe, the river of oblivion. The waters were to wash away all memories of the shade's past life and allow it to be reborn into the same life path. Thousands of cases of reincarnation have been reported by hundreds of expert investigators, and some among them describe the interval between the demise of the former personality and his or her reappearance in another. The most frequent interval appears to be under a year, but periods of several years have been reported as well. And in the case of the historical personages, the interval may extend to centuries. I just want to pause here, just a note from the reader. This doesn't align with Dolores Cannon's work, who says that the same soul or spirit reincarnates after, I think, 125 years, I think is what her studies showed. So the fact that here they're saying less than a year, and her work is pretty recent. I mean, it's over the course of decades, but it's still pretty recent. And this book was published in, oh Lord, when was it published? It was published in 2014, so it's also pretty recent. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I feel like I've seen some reincarnations that have happened in the last year. You know, grandparents that have recently passed, that you can see in other people's children, you know, in their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. But there's always some kind of imprint too, from past relatives, and it's part of kind of sharing the karma. So just an interesting thing. Everything else in this book just aligns, and there isn't really anything new, just being familiar with Dolores Cannon's work, but this was something that was different from what her work has shown. All right, on we go. Intermission-type experiences are clearer also in regard to birthmarks or birth defects that correspond to wounds suffered by the previous personality. The path of no return is highly valued by spiritual masters. The Tibetan Tulku Thondup advised, if you are a highly accomplished meditator, one who has refined and perfected the enlightened nature of the mind, you must remain in that enlightened state without wavering. If you do, instead of rebirth, you could attain Buddhahood. Our consciousness does not end with the demise of our body and continues to exist in another dimension of the cosmos, in the deep dimension we call the Akasha. Afterward, consciousness immortality, the dawn of a new era. Although the big question has not been finally and definitively answered, nor will it ever be, we have good reason to believe that we are immortal. Our mind, like all consciousness in the cosmos, persists indefinitely and perhaps infinitely beyond space and time. And that's it. All right, so some final thoughts from the reader. Besides that one call out, nothing in this book really jumped out at me as new, just being familiar with Dolores Cannon's work and listening to so many of her books. Also, this to me just seems very, very familiar in terms of insights with Many Lives, Many Masters. So I feel like if you've read any of her books or that book, you pretty much have a good handle on all this. And there's nothing really new here. I'm sad to say it, but yeah, I mean, overall good book. It's quite concise. If I were to choose, I'd read Many Lives, Many Masters instead. But this is a good kind of 1,000 level kind of summary.